All right, now that we've learned how different traits can be passed on from parent to offspring, we're going to start looking at some pedigrees. Pedigrees is basically, it's a family tree. It's a diagram we can study to trace certain traits or diseases. So here's one. Here would be a male is a square, and a female is a circle, and a line connecting them is a marriage. Okay, line coming down, and over here, these are all their children. So this man and woman had 4 children. Okay, 1 daughter and 3 sons. This man and woman had 2 children, 2 daughters. This daughter married this guy, and here are their 2 children. Okay, this family tree, this pedigree is the same. It's just tracing different traits. The one on the left is tracing a widow's peak, which is having this little point right here, versus no widow's peak. And this one on the right is tracing an attached earlobe, where your earlobe goes directly into like the side of your face, versus a free earlobe where there's like that little like dangly bit. Okay, and so let's look at it. Are those recessive or dominant? Well, the fact that I filled in the genotype for you is helpful. If you look at widow's peak, all the affected individuals here have a uppercase letter, which means it's dominant. And for the earlobes here, all the affected individuals are both homozygous recessive, both little letters. Okay, so it's a recessive trait. So of course, heterozygotes have one of each allele, right? They have an uppercase and a lowercase, which means they end up carrying the recessive allele, right? Their phenotype will present as dominant, but they will have that little letter with them. Okay, they'll carry it with them, and that's going to become important later. Okay, but just know that the heterozygotes carry those recessive alleles that get masked by the dominant trait. There are a whole bunch of recessively inherited disorders or traits or conditions. We're going to look at 2 genetic disorders. The first one is cystic fibrosis. This affects about 1 in 25,000 people, most common in white people of European descent. And basically what happens is you get 2 copies of malfunctioning protein. Okay, so you get 2 copies of 2 genes in which it doesn't make this membrane protein right, and this membrane protein helps move ions across, which then affects water balance and osmosis. And so if you don't make that protein right, the ions can't move, and so water gets thrown off. And so basically there's going to be this thick mucus that builds up on your cells, specifically your lungs, your digestive tract, and your pancreas. This can severely affect your life expectancy. Medical advances are getting better, but people often don't live a full, quote unquote, like, full life expectancy with cystic fibrosis because of how much it can affect your cells. I'd have this mucus build up. Here's some pictures of some moms clearing the mucus out of their kids' lungs by kind of whacking on them. And this just shows, here's the gene, and it's just this little bit gets messed up. These 3 letters of the DNA get left out, and that causes this membrane protein to happen. And again, because it's recessive, they got both copies. They got a faulty copy from mom and a faulty copy from dad. If we were to look at the pedigree for this, the genotype of a carrier, that would be heterozygous. So they'd be big C, little c, but their phenotype would be, they would be present totally normal because they got 1 working copy of the gene. So they did get that membrane protein produced, and so they would go ahead and live their lives as normal, and they would probably have no idea that they're even a carrier to begin with. Another disorder is called albinism. It affects all ethnicities, about 1 in 17,000 people. And basically, if you get it, again, it's recessive. You get 2 copies of a malfunctioning thing, which means that you can't make an enzyme. And this enzyme is what makes melanin, which gives our hair, eyes, and skin their color. So if you can't make it, you're going to have white hair, pale skin, and really light colored eyes. Or if you can make a little bit of it because it's just kind of produced, but it's produced funky, you might have very, very, very minimal coloration. Okay, this doesn't affect your life expectancy at all, but because you're lacking pigment in your skin, you got to be really careful about sun and sun exposure because you can get a sunburn a lot easier. And because you're lacking pigment in your eyes, that actually throws off your eyesight. And so you typically have pretty terrible eyesight, which leads me to my daughter, Sophie. Here's my little lady. She has albinism. Okay, we adopted her from China. This is her in the orphanage. Look at that cutie. And so obviously you can tell that she doesn't look like quote unquote Chinese, right? She doesn't have the black hair. She doesn't have that like medium skin tone because she can't make it. And so here she is in her little baby glasses. They can't really fix her vision. It helps her see a little bit better, but not great. She'll probably never be able to drive a car. And she's got to be careful in the sun. She rocks sunglasses all the time. She rocks a huge floppy hat and oftentimes some long sleeves in the summer. But other than that, she's like a totally normal little girl. One thing I do want to point out, because a lot of people haven't always met someone with albinism, you might have heard them being called albino. That's sometimes you hear that term too. One thing you might notice, her eyes are not red. Okay, humans don't have red eyes. Sometimes you might see some bunnies that are with white fur or red-eyed. Okay, but humans don't have red eyes. So actually, she has light blue eyes. So there is an example of a human with albinism. So here is an example of just a general pedigree for a recessive trait. And here's how you can tell by just looking at it. Affected individuals can be produced by two unaffected individuals, right? Think about that heterozygous cross that produces two double letters, okay? Which means sometimes this can skip a generation, right? There's nothing in this generation, but here it shows up here. Sometimes we see those carriers shaded in half and half, and sometimes they're not shaded in at all. Just FYI, you might see it both ways. We also have some traits or disorders or conditions that are also dominantly inherited. One is called Huntington's disease, and basically you get this repeat at the end of chromosome 4, which causes this protein to build up in your brain, which causes your brain cells to die and your muscles to lose control and you lose your memory. And you end up dying 10 to 20 years after being diagnosed, which is usually somewhere in middle age-ish. And so that's pretty sad. Again, this is dominantly inherited. Another one is dwarfism, which is pretty surprising to a lot of people. Basically, with dwarfism, what's going on is when we're born, we're mostly cartilage, and this protein and enzyme kind of starts converting cartilage to bone. But if you have dwarfism, you can't do that very well. And so it's kind of shocking to a lot of people to hear that dwarfism is dominant. Okay, a lot of times we think of the dominant thing as being the most common thing or being the quote better thing. It's certainly not quote better. It's not a better or worse situation. And it doesn't always mean the most common because obviously most people aren't dwarfs. Okay, dominant just means if it's present, it shows up. Okay, as it turns out with dwarfism, homozygous dominant individuals die. The heterozygotes become what we know as dwarfs or little people, right? And then the homozygous recessives have normal stature. So that would be all of us. We're all homozygous recessive. Some other examples of conditions that are homozygous recessive, which seems kind of shocking, is having 10 fingers and 10 toes. That's homozygous recessive. And actually having extra digits is a dominantly inherited trait. Kind of crazy, huh? So again, here looking at if we're trying to figure out if a pedigree is dominant or recessive, if one parent has it, one of their children, if one of the children has it, one of their parents must have it. It doesn't skip generations. There's no such thing as a carrier. Here's a cool one, sickle cell anemia. It's both recessive and codominant. We're going to get into it in a second. So here are regular blood cells. If one little change happens in the DNA, it causes one amino acid to be different and they form this sickle shape. This carries oxygen really well. This doesn't. This flows through your blood vessels fine. This kind of gets jammed up. So if you get two recessive copies, all your cells end up like this. And so the oxygen becomes deprived and it will have all of these different effects, which can lead to all of this too. This is called pleiotropy, when just one gene can influence all of these different traits, which is kind of crazy. So how can it be both recessive and codominant? Well, okay. If you are homozygous dominant, all your blood cells look like this. If you're homozygous recessive, all your blood cells are sickle cell. If you're heterozygous, half of them look like this and half of them look like that. So that's why it's codominant, is because they both show up in the heterozygotes. Here's a crazy thing. There's this disease called malaria. Okay, it's pretty common in places like Africa. And malaria lives in red blood cells. And malaria loves to live in these guys, but malaria can't live very well in these guys. So if you live in Africa and you get bitten by a mosquito with malaria and you have like quote unquote normal blood cells, you might actually die from malaria because you're healthy blood cells. If you live in Africa and you have cells like this, the malaria can't live there. So you're going to be safe from malaria, but you're going to have other problems because all of this stuff. You're probably going to die from sickle cell. But what if you're heterozygous? If you're heterozygous, you have both the healthy blood cells and the sickle cells, and you're actually more likely to survive both, which is kind of crazy. This is called the heterozygous advantage, which is pretty neat. So those heterozygotes have a distinct advantage because they're protected from malaria and they're protected, then they don't fully suffer from sickle cell, which is kind of cool. Let's look at this pedigree. Is this recessive or dominant, and how can you tell? This is recessive, and the way we can tell is this affected individual was produced by 2 unaffected parents, okay? So it's recessive, and if we look at the gender split up, is it more affected by males, females, or equal? And we'll see here it's got 3 females and 5 males, so it's way more affected by males. This is what we call a sex-linked trait, okay? This is when it disproportionately affects one gender over the other, okay? Which means it's on that chromosome pair number 23, the sex chromosomes. So here are our chromosomes. Here is the X chromosome. There's lots of stuff on the X, which is why both genders have it. This is why it's teeny tiny, and really the only thing on here is this determining region, which basically like ends up making male hormones, which of course lead to all the male traits that we think of as quote unquote male, like the low voice and the increased body hair and all those kind of things, okay? So that's what's going on with those chromosomes. Now, let's take a look at a sex-linked trait, which is hemophilia, okay? Now, here's a mom, and this is, so here she is, she's a carrier. She's got 1 normal hemophilia gene and 1 non-normal. So what hemophilia is it's a blood clotting thing. Where normal people are blood clots and form scab. People with hemophilia, they don't form scabs very well, so they can possibly bleed to death, okay? So here's a mom, she's a carrier. Here's a dad who's unaffected. If we do the Punnett square, we see that these 3 individuals are going to be just fine, okay? But that this one is going to have hemophilia. But let's take a step back. If you look, the gender of these 2, the sex would be girls. So all the girls are fine. Here, half of the boys are going to be fine and half of the boys aren't going to be fine because a dad can only give 1 X to his daughter. So in order for your daughter to have it, your dad would have to have it and your mom would have to have her be a carrier. For a son, though, the son's getting their X from their mom. So for a son, you're a 50-50 chance if your mom's a carrier. Is your mom going to give you the working one or the not working one? Does that make sense? Okay. If your mom has it and you're her son, then you automatically have it because your mom has to give that to you. If that makes sense. Okay. So again, with sex-linked chromosomes, we see that the trait affects males more than females because, again, there's way more stuff happening on the X chromosome, so it's probably coming on the X chromosome, and it's recessive because if it's dominant, it would show up equally. All right. So here are some of the big highlights of this lecture, things to consider. Hopefully you can answer these questions, and here's where we are in the textbook.